Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Diego Granados, and I'm a product manager at Microsoft working on AI and machine learning. I'm super excited to be here with everyone, sharing the life of what is it to be a product manager in the AI and machine learning world. So thank you so much for inviting me. Super excited to be here.
Yes, it's great to have you, Diego. I'm super excited to have you here. I'm Kenton from the Rocket Blocks team. And today, as Diego mentioned, we're going to be talking all about machine learning and what it means to be a product manager focusing on machine learning products and features. So let's go ahead and just jump into it. Let's tackle it head
Awesome.
on, Diego.
Super excited.
Tell me, like, in your opinion, what is some of the key differences between being a generalist product manager, like a product manager, say, just like hired into one of the big tech companies and is going to get dropped into a team, versus a machine learning focused product manager? What are the key deltas we should think about there?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that you don't realize until you actually start being a PM for an AI team is that, contrary to the majority of the teams out there that don't deal with AI and machine learning, in this case, the majority of your group, when it comes to the development part of it, meaning the engineering group, is going to be, the ratio is going to be different. What I mean by that is you're going to have a bigger team of data scientists and a smaller team of engineers. So that doesn't mean that you get less resources in engineering. It just means that you're going to get more resources, typically more than engineering, on the data science side of the development. And that changes everything. When we talk about Agile, not everything in Agile actually adapts to the work that data scientists do. So you have
Mm,
to think differently in terms of timelines, in terms of development, even creating stories, features, tasks. Everything is a little bit different in the data science world. So that's, I would say, one of the biggest difference. The second one is that if you say, for example, you don't have a technical background, or even if you do and you specialize on, let's pick something easy, mobile apps. I'm sure that at some point you learn, by developing mobile apps, you learn about databases and you learn about SQL and you learn about the front end and back end. And so then that can be translated into anything else. When it comes to machine learning, it's a whole different universe. Nothing that you learned in one of those technologies is going to be useful when you interact with the data scientist. So the language, and we can go deeper into that, but the language that you speak with that part of the team, it's going to be very different. And I would say the third thing, and I think it's also one of the biggest ones. And let me just make a parenthesis. Yeah, sure. When we talk about hardware, being a PM for hardware, typically you look at development cycles of years or long months, and so there's a whole PRD process, so on and so forth. But thinking about a little bit more like software versus AI machine learning, the development time, it's typically the same, but there's a big part in the front, which is just testing, doing tests. And it's not like in engineering where you do MVPs and then get the feedback, launch something in the market. There's a ton of proof of concepts that you need to do with the data science team before even the engineering team starts to actually engage into how do we launch this into the market or whatever the engineering team is going to do. So happy to talk more about these things, but I would say those are the three big different things that you can think of: a traditional PM path versus an AI and machine learning PM path.
yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So I think those are three great points. I have a few follow-up questions. Tell
Yeah.
me a little bit. So the first one you mentioned was basically the organizational makeup of the teams you're working with as a machine learning focused PM will probably be different. Way more data science heavy than, say, engineering. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I imagine also, given how machine learning often gets baked into products, that it may mean that your sort of core team that you work with probably doesn't have designers. It may not, may not have like a product marketing representative, because that person or those people may be attached to other teams that are more user facing that then do marketing, and your sort of ML is a layer in there. So the question is, one, is that accurate, or there are assumptions there that I'm making that are wrong that you can debunk? And then the second thing that I'd love to hear is, like you mentioned, when your makeup of the team shifts so dramatically towards, say, data scientists from engineers and systems engineers, you said like the task will change, the stories will change. Could you pick like one of those and give me an example of, like, tactically, how does, like, say, user stories change in your mind for a machine learning PM versus like a generalist PM?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting with the first part about the type of team, like every other PM that you've probably spoken with, the answer is, well, it depends. It
A
depends on what.
PM's favorite answer.
Exactly. For everything that we answer, the answer is going to be always it depends. No, but in all seriousness, so it depends on different factors. So, for example, if we were talking about, and I'll talk about my case in a moment, but if we were talking about we're building an AI ML platform layer where others are going to build on top of that, then maybe yes, it's only going to be a team that is much more focused on the experimentation, and then the engineering team working on packaging those experiments or that platform, and then maybe surface that in other products or handing that off to other teams to build on top of that. That's one of the layers of machine learning. The one that I work with is actually building models, and I need to make sure that whatever complexities we're building within these algorithms are translated into something that customers who are not data scientists, who have no idea about machine learning, can understand. So in my case, I actually do work with marketing, I work with designers, I work with UX, but that's not true for all the PMs in machine learning, just like it's not true for all PMs in other types of
Yeah.
projects, right? But in my particular case, is one of my I would say toughest parts of the job is to actually figure out how do we make this so how to make this thing that is incredibly complex, that is measured in very specific ways that only data scientists understand. How do we take that and then say to somebody who has no clue about machine learning, you can trust the model. Let me change that. You can trust that we're predicting the future based on these three, four things, whatever number of things, and trust us with your data, trust us with, follow this and you're going to do whatever marketing campaigns or whatever you want to do with the data. So it's a lot of complexity on how I, as the PM, need to translate not only to the customer, but then to the design team saying, hey, these complex things that you probably don't understand in depth, I need to help you to basically come up with some great specs, great designs to translate that. And there's a big component of ethics around all of this discussion that we're doing that is also
Yeah.
part of my job as a PM.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the point about sort of the translation, right? Like, I think, a lot of technical PM interviews these days, it's less about like, hey, can you get up to the whiteboard and really like write some complicated code, but more like, hey, can you speak intelligently and
Yeah,
fluently about a technical concept, because you may need to be the person that understands what engineering is doing and then communicating and making sure that the marketing team understands so they can effectively promote the product in the marketplace. And the design team, like you mentioned, can sort of highlight and surface the right information in a user-friendly way, et cetera.
exactly. Yeah, you're exactly right.
And then, your second point was I think that one of the things that is maybe tough or challenging or interesting about the MLPM roles is the knowledge you gain there is highly specialized, and maybe that the some of the product management knowledge that you gained in other type of generalist roles won't really apply or won't be super useful.
That is correct.
Like, I think you used the example of like the tech stack, right? Like learning front end, back end, like here's how it connects to the database, the API sends information hither and thither. Some of it probably is still relevant, but it's like it's not as transferable, and you probably have to learn another whole domain.
You're absolutely right. There are some transferable things. There is, for example, the biggest question when you start an AI ML project is, okay, where are we going to surface these models? Like, what's the end of the model? The model is going to give you, in the end, a prediction, right? Let's assume that we're building a model to predict something. But what are you going to do with that? Where is that going to be surfaced? So there's definitely a tech stack that goes into the mix to say, well, it's going to be surfaced into a product or a website or an app or whatever. So there's definitely a lot of transferable things. But think of the AI ML world as almost a siloed part of the technology, because in the end, for example, when I was learning about machine learning at the beginning, I always thought it was going to be this super, very complicated thing that you needed to code in order to produce the algorithm. When in reality, and when you look at all the videos that are out there in machine learning, it's like 20 slides to explain what is a decision tree or what is a neural network. But the reality is, when you go into the code, it's two lines of code to produce a machine learning model. But what you have to understand is the whole process that data scientists go through, from cleaning the data, creating features and labels and a bunch of other technicalities in machine learning, all the way to we see the results of the model and then we evaluate it based on different metrics. And you can talk about precision, recall, accuracy, F1 scores, and a bunch of other things that, let's say, the buzzwords of machine learning.
Yeah.
But then it's about going back and forth and saying, well, that's not the end of it. How do we improve this result? And what is our target? And what are we trying to do with this result? All of that in itself is not something that you learn anywhere else. So there's definitely some applicable things. And what do we do with the model? What do we do with the results? How is this going to get to the end customer? But just being in a room with 5 or 6 data scientists speaking about all of this is not something that you can learn from, developing cloud solutions, software as a service, mobile apps. It's something that you need to study. You need to go deep to really understand what is everything that is happening in that room with the 5 or 6 data scientists.
Yeah, totally. I like the word that you used there specifically at one point, like silo. It's a silo of knowledge that you probably have to go relatively deep into. I love that point that you brought up, because it actually brings me directly into the second question I wanted to ask you, which is, what is the engagement model for a machine learning PM? Like some of these topics you just mentioned. You talked about things like precision, you talked about recall, we talked about decision trees, neural networks. Let's pick one of those. Let's say your team is building some sort of machine learning based off a neural network. Walk me through where you think a machine learning PM does engage in that process, and how technical do they need to be able to effectively work on that at a company like Microsoft or another big tech company?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that question, the where does the PM comes into that process of a data science team building a neural network model to create a solution for something. The process, I think it's, if not the same, very similar to any other PM. It starts with the job of the PM in AI machine learning, in the AI ML world, starts with, okay, let's talk to customers, let's understand the problem, let's figure out what are we solving, right? And just like you would do with your engineering team for creating a mobile app or a website, that you're not going to tell them how to do it, is the same thing in the data science world. You're not going to tell them, I want you to build a neural network with these specifications and these hyperparameters in order to blah. It's not like that. It's more about, this is the problem. This is what the customer pain point is, and we need to solve it. So we go into, and this is what I was saying at the beginning, which is the big time when it comes to doing proof of concepts and experimentations, because the team needs to understand, it's not like, opening up your terminal and coding a simple hello world and boom, you're done. It's more about, all right, let's look at the data. How is the customer data? Let's clean the data. Let's understand it. Let's figure out what attributes or what features are actually relevant, which ones are actually going to cause problems in the model. So there's a lot of studies that the data science team needs to do. So at that moment in time, you as the PM, is just like your prototype iteration, getting feedback. You do the same thing, but in this case, when looking at the data. Then it comes the development of the model. And like I said, the developing the model is 2 lines of code, 3, maybe sometimes 4, but that's it. But your job is not to say, hey, is the neural network ready? It's more about, all right, we have a base model. Is it doing what we want? And most likely the answer is going to be no. All right, so just like in creating a mobile app, you're not going to tell them, maybe you should write these 3 lines of code to improve it. It will be more about, what if we add these extra features? What if we remove these other features? Well, the customer doesn't have this kind of data. What if we ask the customer to give the data in this other way? So you, at that moment, start brainstorming with them to see how you solve the problem with the customer in mind. They'll create the model, they'll create the scripts, and then you launch it. And the launching part, that is, you finish the model, that's cool, but now you need to give it to the customer. How? That's the engineering team comes into play. How are you going to give it to them? And then you become sort of like a, let's say, regular or traditional PM, where you actually have to shift. And I'll think about, okay, what is the tech stack in order for us to launch the model? How is it going to look? Designers, so on and so forth. So you kind of play this dual role in more cases, at least in my case, where you play the regular PM and the AI and machine learning PM. So there's a lot of transferable things between the development of both, I would say.
Yeah, it's I like that answer, and I think like the good news I feel like from someone who maybe say a PM and is interested in shifting and doing more ML work is what I think you're highlighting in the beginning is, hey, the sort of core product development process of starting with a pain point, thinking about solutions, prioritizing, testing some of those, iterating, launching.
Exactly.
It's the same. It's the same. It's just that what you're working on is different. And I think the second part that then you highlight is maybe some of the key deltas are as a PM focusing on this, like when you are digging in at certain steps, like is the model
Exactly.
doing what we want it to do? Probably not in round one. But I think what you would probably need, it sounds like you're saying, is you probably need a little more fluency. You need a little more familiarity and fluency with those particular topics that are going to come up in the
Yeah,
evaluation of models, so that you can
absolutely.
be a productive partner to the data science team versus like just the PM who's like, hey, make it better.
Absolutely. And I've had, so part of my team, we get requests from other teams, and sometimes the requests come in the form of, hey, I would love for your model to do coffee in the morning and then send all the emails that I need to do in the afternoon, and boom, I'm done with my work. So people come up with these crazy ideas, and your job as the PM in the AI world is also to understand how a model works, where can it be improved, how can it be improved. And part of it is because you're going to have to say no to a lot of things that all of these stakeholders have to will come to you and ask for. In a regular PM world, it will happen the same thing, but probably, like I said, the tech stack and all that information or knowledge is transferable. But in the AI world, you need to know, at least in depth, as much as possible, the world of AI, so that you can push back and say no, and here's why, and here's a good answer as to the model can't do that because of XYZ, or if we do that, then we're going to get into some issues like target leaking and curse of dimensionality and a bunch of another set of buzzwords in machine learning. But it's exactly that. Or let me just add one more case. You're absolutely right. The data scientists are not going to come to you and say, hey, Diego, how do we improve the model? They know how to improve the model. But when they come to you and say, oh, we increase AUC ROC by 10%, but the precision and recall went down, you need to, at that moment, think, hold on, are we willing to make that trade-off? Why yes or why not? And which one do we prefer? And those are things that the data scientists will share their opinion. They're going to give you their input, but you have to know what's more important for the customer. And
Yeah.
sometimes ROC will be more important, sometimes PR, sometimes F1, depending on the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make, because it comes back to sort of a canonical bit of like, what is the role of a PM? Like you're in some ways, right? There's that great scene in Office Space where they're talking about like PMs, and it's like, well, you don't write the code and you don't sell the product, so like, what would you say you do here? You're like this glue function in the middle. But I think what happens and where the value gets added is where like one function can sort of give you the basics, but they don't understand what's happening on the other end of the spectrum. And like the PM, you're saying like, even though it's ML, it's different, the nature of the problem is the same, where you need to be able to understand what your team is telling you and then connect it with like, ultimately, okay, like what are the nuance and the contours of what customers want. And like you mentioned, like is sacrificing precision the right outcome for our customers here?
Right.
Does that make the products better for them? Yeah, cool, awesome. Well, so the next thing I wanted to ask you about, and I think we've already touched on it a little bit, but I'm going to ask just to make sure we get all the sort of nooks and crannies of it out.
Sure.
But if you think about the process of building like a new, maybe like, let's say launching a new ML model to do X, and you can sort of choose any example you want, but like walk me through sort of like the life cycle of what that looks like at a high level. I think you said like, well, there's the user pain point, and then you build and iterate. But to the extent you can give me a little more detail about like, what does that actually look like in the ML world versus say PM working on a mobile app or
absolutely,
web app?
Absolutely. I think it starts with a big difference that we don't typically ask that much in a mobile app or cloud or whatever other function, or the type of tech that we use. And that is, do we need AI and machine learning to solve this problem? Because a bunch of times we start with thinking, hey, this is really cool, let's build a model, and boom, done. And many times it's like, you don't actually need a model, you're going to spend resources.
Yeah.
So when you start understanding the problem that the customer brings to you, and this is just like in a regular PM job, customer interviews or surveys, you start with the ideation of interviewing customers, hypotheses, all that.
Yeah.
But you also ask yourself and the team, do we actually need AI and ML to solve this problem? Typically, in our case, the answer is yes, and here's why: all the reasons. So we understand the customer problem. We understand that we need to build this product, this machine learning model. Let's say it's a prediction for, think of a product recommendation, or something that you can see in
Sure.
Amazon.
Classic
Right?
like recommendation algorithm.
Exactly. So a recommendation algorithm. So we have to build that. Okay. So how do we do it? Well, first we need to understand what kind of recommendations. So let's understand the business case. Let's understand the business scenario. Now that we understand a little bit more that, oh, maybe it's not an e-commerce like Amazon. Maybe it's an, recommendations of a salesperson that needs to pick up the phone and recommend some products. All right, cool. So let's look at the data, because we're going to build, maybe it's something unique to the customer. Maybe it's something that will apply to all retailers or financial institutions or whatever it is. So you need to think about those kind of industry expertise. And the model will be very different depending on that. And I'll explain why in just a moment. And once you understand the problem and the business scenario, you have to look at the data. So you typically do a proof of concept. You look at the data, and this is what I was saying earlier. There's a long time of just researching, understanding data, understanding how it will work. Then once we know, okay, this is going to be a model that is going to be built specifically for banking industry or for retailers, the features, or in other words, think of a table, the columns in the data are going to be very different for one industry than for another. And if you're thinking
Yeah.
about, well, I want something that applies to everyone, then it's a whole different universe that you have to think about. And that's where you start with an MVP. You start with a simple model that is not going to be the best performing model, but it's going to produce an output. And just like in a mobile app or in a website or something else, you create the MVP. The data scientists create the model. You get into a phone call, you show it to the customer and say, hey, here's the results. We want feedback. We want to hear what you think about it. And you get the feedback, and then you iterate until there's a point. And I think this is another big difference is, once you get enough feedback, instead of going it in an agile way and then going back and forth with the customer showing updates, once you get all the feedback that you need, you actually spend a lot of time in development, a little bit in silence, in the sense that you don't need more feedback. The customer already told you everything that you needed about the data, about the use cases, about the business scenario. So the data science team will spend a lot of time developing the model. And once it's done, then you go into the launching phase. And that's where you switch. I mean, as a PM, you're constantly switching between the data science world and the regular, on how we're launching it and how the
Yeah.
consumer is going to use this. But in the launching phase, then that's where we start thinking about, okay, how are we going to surface this? What integration do we need? What's the platform? What's the tech stack? How do we deliver this to the customer? And then that the engineering team comes into play for all of this. And then, of course, as you are planning this launching, there's conversations with legal throughout the whole entire process
Yeah.
to figure out what yes, what no.
Always legal.
Exactly. We at Microsoft, and I hope every company, we have this whole ethical review process to make sure that we are compliant with some at least the basics of ethics in AI world, that in Microsoft we're building an internal thing about AI and ethics. Then we have marketing, we have UX. So the whole process continues. The bigger portion of development and POCs happens at the beginning with data scientists.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense. Tell me a little bit. One portion I wanted to dig into a little bit is when you start learning about machine learning, I think for the first time, and especially like the explosion of sort of use cases that have come out recently. There's some patterns that emerge about like why this is happening now, because a lot of these modeling techniques, right, have existed for decades.
Yeah.
Like 1960s, 1970s. Like some of the techniques are not very new. But like the amount of sort of compute power we have these days and the amount of data that's out there is, orders of magnitude greater than we had back then. So that's like a big difference. And I think specifically, one thing I hear repeatedly when talking to MLPMs is like the amount of time spent on like that phase that I think you sort of mentioned about, like researching the data available, thinking about it. And then other just like some tactical things that come up, right? Like cleaning data, labeling data. So can you speak from your perspective as a PM, how much time do you end up sinking into some of those tactical data problems? Or is it something that your data science team is really wrestling with and you sort of are hands off?
Yeah, I think it's an eternal problem because you're right. Even if we build these systems that could help us with that, then the next generation of whatever dimension of new data we have, and so from big data we go to something else, and it just grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I think there's no easy way to solve that problem. As the PM, my input in this phase of let's look at the data, let's look at how do we clean it, let's look at features, importance, all that stuff. My input as a PM is to say, okay, our customer is a retailer. What are the most important things for them? Well, for this retailer in particular, it could be, of course, the transactions, but they also want to see, for example, the reviews that people leave online. And they additionally want to figure out if color blue in this particular set of items are the most important ones. So I am the one who brings that customer input to say, we have an ocean of data. Yes, it's an ocean, it's enormous, it's gigantic, but let's scope it down to the things that are really, really, really important to the customer. That's really my input. I personally, this is Diego, I'm a data driven person. I love looking at data, and so sometimes I do ask the team, hey, let's analyze this, let's analyze that other thing. Can I help with something? Can I look at the data myself? Can I help with, maybe I'm not the expert in cleaning the data, but at least I want to look at the data. So it depends on the PM on that last part that I mentioned, but typically it's more about the input of there's 50 columns that we can look at. Let's look at only these 5 to begin with, and then we can expand little by little into looking at something else.
Yeah.
Because, and let me just make that one note there, because the bigger problem is that data scientists want more data, they want more features, they want more things to analyze. But the customer, they don't care about everything, or rather, not that they don't care, but it could be overwhelming for them to say, hey, we looked at 500 things and 500 things are important, right? There's a whole
Yeah.
process on how to translate what's important to the model and a ton of other complexities. So you also have to be careful of how do you communicate all of this that you're doing to the customer so that it doesn't look like a black box, and that they actually trust in what you're doing and the model.
Yeah, make it simple for the customer. It is sounds like one thing, and then I think the other key part you mentioned there, which I'll just highlight and tease out, is your role as the PM. Often the key responsibility there is, thinking about the ocean of data available to you, and using the logic of, or the filter rather, of customer insight you have, and sort of the business needs, and filtering down to like, okay, here's probably the things that are going to matter most. Here's the things we should focus on,
Right.
and experiment with, because this is where we're likely going to get the most leverage. And then of course, exactly. I think, you also mentioned like, hey, like I like to go sort of, poke around in the data myself because I'm curious and I want to see it. And I think probably a lot of other PMs are similar in that way. That may not be their main responsibility, but they'll go do some exploration and
exactly.
and reconnaissance as well. Awesome. Okay, so I want to wrap up here with one final question for you, which is, if you are a product manager, maybe you're an aspiring product manager for the first time, or maybe you are currently a product manager, but you don't really work on ML, AI stuff, and you want to shift into that realm. What are your tips for someone in that position? Maybe like the top 2 things you would recommend, like, hey, you should start doing X and Y if this is something you're serious about for a career move.
Yeah, absolutely. The good news is that all of the soft skills, if you're already a PM, all of the soft skills are transferable. There's nothing different. There's nothing that is unique to the AI ML world in that sense. If you have experience building mobile apps or cloud applications or anything like that, there's a bunch that will be transferable. So that's also great news. If you're not a PM right now, again, learn about the soft skills, try to get that through projects and show it in your resume. So all of that universe of the PM, everything is transferable, everything counts. That's awesome. If you want to get into the AI machine learning world, just like you would see, for example, engineers or some technical PMs share in their resume or website or wherever a GitHub with a lot of projects that highlight, yes, I know how to code, or I know how to create a mobile app, and here's a
Yeah.
tested black, whatever, is the same thing, but you have to do it in the AI world. But there's a big difference here. Like I mentioned earlier, the code for a neural network is 2 lines of code. It's literally one instruction in Python. That's it, right? You tune things here and there, but if you wanted to say, I know how to code a neural network, it's 1 line of code in Python. So
Right.
that's
Well,
the thing,
thankfully,
right?
due to all the libraries, right?
Exactly.
There is some complexity hidden behind that one line.
Exactly. So in machine learning, it's to show your PM skills in AI. It's not about saying I know how to code a neural network, because that's not going to be your job. You're going to be really far away from that in the day to day. So what you need to do is you need to, for example, there's a great website. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but it's either Kaggle or Kaggle,
Yeah.
kaggle.com. And it's a website for data science competitions, machine learning competitions, fantastic free courses on AI machine learning. Go in there, learn about Python, learn about machine learning, start participating in competitions. And what you want to do is you want to create great documentation, because you want to document, here's the business problem. Let's look at the data. Here are the insights on the data. Here's how we clean the data and why we're cleaning it this way. Here's the model. We see these results, but the results are not optimal. Here's how and why we're going to improve it. And here's the final result. Here's how it compares to other models. And here's the expected outcome, or whatever this business, whether it's a real or a fake competition, could expect from this output. What you want to show is that you understand the full process of going from the customer data, the customer requirements, data cleaning, creating the model, fine tuning it, and the outcome, versus saying, hey, I know how to code. Here's a Jupyter notebook with 2 lines of code. And yeah, I can do a neural network. Anybody can do that. So that would be my advice, is set up your Kaggle or Kaggle open notebooks and just
Yeah.
share it, and use that when you network with PMs or hiring managers in the AI world, and say, hey, by the way, I also participate in competitions. I have an open notebook, happy to share it. I think that's the easiest way to show that you want to become a PM in the AI world.
Awesome. I like that tip a lot. I have one last question, which is, say you're like slightly earlier in that process and you're not ready to like jump into doing competitions, right? Like that sounds a little intimidating. Or you're like, I need to learn the basics first. Do you have like a particular, like, is there like an ML course or any particular one that you would recommend? Because there's so much content out there. Like, I know Google actually puts out a lot of stuff about like learning machine learning, and there's Coursera courses, but is there like one particular one that we should point to or put in the show notes or anything like that?
Yeah, I would say two. And let me make a parenthesis. I think I haven't seen all the courses that Amazon, Microsoft, or Google offer. I think they're geared almost towards their cloud services. So you even get a certification, but it's very specific to their cloud offering.
Okay.
But I wouldn't go to those, and I may be wrong, but anyway, I wouldn't go to those right away. I would take 2 courses. One on the same Kaggle website. There's one free that goes from the very, 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 very basics of this is Python, and here's how you code hello world in Python. Goes into machine learning, hyperparameter tuning, and starts little by little evolving in the how to do it in the day to day. I would
Awesome.
take that to learn how to do it. And the second course is go to Coursera. There's a few great courses on machine learning from Stanford. That's going to give you a big in-depth into the math and uh, the terminology, the
Theory, maybe.
the theory, everything that is important around machine learning. I think combining those 2 courses, I think is fantastic. If you feel a little bit lost with the math, don't stress too much about it. You're not going to use it every day as a PM, so you can skip that part if you feel like you need to. Focus more on what is this model used for, how does this model compare to this other model, what metrics do I use. So focus on that part, and then combine it with practicing on Kaggle, and you should be set.
I love that. That's awesome. One super practical, like tactical, like here's how to actually, get your hands dirty with Python, and here's the math, here's the theory, here's
Yeah,
all the
exactly.
terminology you need to know. Great combination. I think this is a really good place to end. Thank you so much for joining us, Diego. It was great to have you on the channel, and look forward to more insights. And thank you for sharing all the ML knowledge with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here with you, and for everybody watching, thank you so much.